Great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor James Buchanan, distinguished Emeritus Professor at Virginia Polytechnic and State University, and also at George Mason University. It's our tradition at the Summer Institute to have Jim open the Summer Institute, give the first talk every morning. And you'll notice that this room is full. This is always the highlight of the Summer Institute. Not to say Chris Martin that things will continue to go uphill. It's just wonderful to have Jim here yet again. And today he's going to talk about the fiscal tragedy that we have found ourselves in, institutional sources of that. The paper is online. If you haven't yet been able to download it, please feel free to go ahead and do that. But I hope that lots of you have had a chance to take a look at it. So with that, Jim, welcome. And
thank you, Sandy. I appreciate the opportunity to come back and talk to the Institute, which is sort of becoming an institution of itself. My visits here. Had a pretty rough winter, so it looked like I might not make it for a while, but I'm glad to be back. Actually, the last 4 years, I have sort of given a sequence of talks, all related to the Great Recession and the economists' reaction to the Great Recession, why our economists failed so badly in either predicting or responding to the Great Recession. And this, in one sense, is a sequence to following along with that, but it also is a departure in a certain sense. Prior sessions I have discussed, first of all, that it was obvious to me and many others that the Great Recession was caused by simply the rules failed. The rules fell down. It wasn't that the market fell down or the enterprise system. It was basically they were operating without rules. And no one could have expected the market to generate its own rules. And then the second year I wrote, 3 years ago, I gave a talk on what I call the old and new Chicago School. And by the old Chicago School, I meant the one that I studied under around the middle of the century, a little before the middle of the century. Henry Simon in particular, and he would never have countenanced this view that came up with a lot of the modern absurdities that the market will work no matter what circumstances there might be. And the Chicago School of that period was working very closely in line with, although not overtly, with the Viking group, the Ordo Liberals centered in Freiburg in Germany. And I'm very pleased that now there's work done trying to look at both of those traditions again and see, because that is clearly what is needed in a certain sense. And a historical look would be very useful. And then I looked a little more closely at what happened and why economists went so badly wrong in this view. And a year ago, I gave a talk which I called Analysis and Ideology, and arguing that it was basically a scientific fault in the failure of economists to look at these rules, this idea that the market will always work. And I used it as a basis of a criticism a year ago in my talk of work by Anatol Koletsky in particular, his book called Capitalism 4.0, in which he buys into the George Soros view that it was an ideology, it was what they call market fundamentalism that drove economists to make these rather gross errors. And I was arguing in that paper that, in fact, it was basically a scientific mistake, this idea that the market can generate its own rules. And it's pushing the whole rational expectation spillovers and everything was was pushing the rationality concept far beyond its limits, and therefore caused all the problem for economists. I was thinking about these notes last night. One thing that dusted off that I remembered from my graduate school days, namely there was an American economist named J.M. Clark who wrote the first part of the century or the mid-century. And he was famous for me for one quotation came from him, where he argued that his fellow economists had an irrational passion for dispassionate rationality. And that fits the whole rational expectation movement perfectly to a T, it seems to me. And I was quite frankly, I was very surprised at the elevation of Tom Sargent to a prize, because if anything failed, it ought to be an irrational expectation movement. Yet the Nobel people seem to be picking that up, pulled that too late in a way. But anyway, that's beside that point. Well, what I'm shifting into, what I'm going to do here today, or this paper tries to do, is shift away from sort of economists and how they reacted to the Great Recession, and look more carefully at the more permanent problems that we face in terms of this fiscal tragedy, namely that we seem to have got ourselves in this unsustainable fiscal mess in which we are spending so much more by everybody's agreement than we are able to spend, and yet we don't seem to be able to get out of it. So it's a genuine tragedy of the commons. So the word tragedy comes from this analogy with the commons. That is to say, we just keep tapping that fiscal potential, and we're dissipating the value that could be there from collective effort. And so what I tried to do here was to start and try to think about why we are in such a mess, not to worry about sort of short-run fix, not worry about fiscal austerity to try to sort of squeeze down and get back to something, but rather what are the institutions? What are our decision processes or institutions that in fact generate these results? And that's what this is. And I isolate three separate ones, although they aren't separated. They're all very closely interrelated. But for purposes of thinking about them, we can think in terms of these three sort of categories or groups, again, recognizing the interrelationship. And the first is, of course, the first two actually are familiar. The third one is the one that I want to concentrate a little more work on, and therefore is much less mature in its status. And the first is, of course, the most familiar of all, and that is the Keynesian invention, so to speak, of fiscal policy. Traditionally, we had justification by the classical tradition by economists of the issue of public debt, when in fact government was faced with extraordinary demand, expected to be temporary, and when there were genuine capital projects that would yield income over percentages the government could expect. In the classical tradition, it was against all principles to issue debt just for the purpose of promoting some macroeconomic result. And there was a genuine fiscal religion, so to speak, that kept within those bounds of the legitimacy of issuing debt. Well, what the Keynesian Revolution did is sweep that away completely. First, they converted the economists, and the economists began to lock on to the Keynesian notion that you use fiscal policy in order to add to aggregate demand or to reduce aggregate demand, and to use the budget as an instrument for macroeconomic objectives, performance objectives, and that sort of let the thing go. In order to justify this, economists spent a lot of time in the Keynesian heyday arguing that really public debt doesn't matter. They completely fouled up their logic. Well, my first book, as a matter of fact, was go back to the classical tradition in public debt and straighten up a lot of the economic nonsense that was going on about that. But this sort of stayed within the economics discussion for a decade or so. But then in the 60s, the politicians had finally caught on. And of course, they could take these economic arguments and justify spending. And they overlooked, the economists had overlooked the simplest of all public choice points, namely that politicians enjoy going back to their constituencies to say they spent money on this or that hospital, that school, that road, whatever it might be, that boondoggle, whatever it might be. But they don't enjoy going back and say, I raised your taxes. Very, very simple, simplistic, actually, point that the economists totally overlooked. And that's all part and parcel of the standard economist presumption that they didn't even examine, that somehow they were always advising a benevolent despot who was going to listen to what they say. And this is sort of idea of a monolithic, centralized decision maker imposing policies as dictated by the economist consultants. That was pervasive in the whole discussion at that time. And public choice simply just said the king really has no clothes in that sense. So that sort of was a background for why we got into this mess of permanent deficits, because that is what is the popular interest, and the economists' arguments seem to support that. So you can argue for, in that context, you argue for deficit spending more or less always. And that sort of coupled with this notion that somehow or another deficits, even though they aren't used explicitly for macroeconomic purpose, deficits provide a good balancer. That is, if you have only so much revenue coming in and much more spending than the revenue will generate, you can always have debt to fill in the gap, sort of a residual filler in of this financing gap. As a result, you get not nearly as much pressure to raise taxes on the one hand or to cut back spending on the other, so long as the deficit was flexible and could expand in that context. And in that setting, you also had a reinforcer of the difficulties of this dilemma or tragedy, if you want to call it that, by this introduction or rediscovery, so to speak, of the old Ricardian equivalence, that is to say, in pure accounting terms, the present value of a tax is equivalent to the debt that might substitute for that tax as a financing way of financing spending. So therefore, there was an equivalence between debt and taxes, which is absurd on the face of it, because nobody would go into debt under such circumstances. Nobody would pay a tax on such circumstances. So that sort of muddied up the water, so to speak. So you got this sort of acquiescence in debt that was understandably gives you this sort of quasi-permanent regime of deficits. So that's sort of the first source of this tragedy that I'm talking about. That's number one. The second one is also familiar, although not quite as familiar as the first. The second one is this asymmetry between the spending side and the tax side of the fiscal account in terms of the discriminatory aspect, that is, in terms of generality versus discrimination. Now, after yesterday and in general, we're breaking it down, but there still remains a distinction between the extent to which generality can describe the tax side versus the spending side, almost by necessity. On the spending side, spending is done for particularized, defined programs. And so you have, rather than generality, you have discrimination as a natural aspect of the spending side. And at least ideally, at least constitutionally, as the original intent, and certainly the principles would be such that on the tax side, you want to have generality. That is to say, you want to have non-discrimination becomes an objective of the taxation. You don't want particular groups singled out for imposition of taxes. Now, almost by necessity, as I say, you must have generality within limits on the spending side, because that's where it comes out. That you spend to get a program going. So you therefore have discrimination as a natural factor. On the tax side, you get discrimination. We have all sorts of exemptions, deductions, credits, whatever penalties, whatever we do on the tax side. But at least we still pay some lip service, and it's still institutionally true that there's much more generality on the tax side than there is on the spending side. Now, given that fact, if you accept that, then it's obvious that you've got more concentrated pressures of special interest groups or beneficiary groups, bureaucracies on the spending than you do on the taxing. So you have a natural bias toward pushing politically on almost any political decision structure, pushing the spending successfully as opposed to pushing a tax reduction, particularly, especially. So you get this disparity here between these two sides of the account, and you couple that with the notion that somehow you can get your taxes and spending. You somehow organize coalitions in such ways to get them through a process. I'll come back to that in a minute later. But if you have this greater concentration of spending, greater concentration of pressures on politicians to spend than to tax, or to cut taxes, increase spending, cut taxes, then you naturally have this majority rule working. You have different majority coalitions forming, getting their programs together, pushing beyond any really reasonable limits. Now that was originally one of Gordon Tulloch's first articles, was called Some Problems of Majority Voting, in which he talked about that. He had the analysis right, in which you get an overspending as a result of this rotating coalitions of special groups making coalitions with each other, then forming other coalitions for other programs, and so forth and so on. So you get that that result, this differential in the, or asymmetry between the spending side and the tax side in terms of the concentrations of pressure. Now that's closely related to, that's familiar within limits. Ewan and I wrote a piece several years ago which we called Majoritarian Management of the Commons. We explicitly treated the commons metaphor and used the commons metaphor as helpful here. Thorpe did not in his initial piece use that metaphor. But as I say, that's broadly, that's familiar, at least within public choice circles, that's familiar, that second sort of asymmetry between pressure and spending and the tax side. And public debt one, the first one I mentioned, was our deficit was familiar. The third category, I think in one sense is more important than for either of those, and it's more simple, it's simpler, but it's been grossly neglected by economists. And this is a puzzle to me, and I've been excited about this now for about several months. And I'm hoping to develop more, and what I do here is just a preliminary of what may be going on here. And that is, we fail to sort of follow up and really look at the institutions which seem to be operative in our governmental structures, and how these institutions really generate results that we should be clear that we haven't really worked on at all. I don't know quite how to put the whole thing except to say that we have failed to look at the institutional structures through which fiscal decisions actually get made. Now, that's not saying that's not just saying this sort of view that institutions matter. Of course they matter. And it's not saying we ought to spend time grubbing around and worrying about particularized institutions. That's not what I'm after. But we have not even worked out the abstract models for this. And it's fascinating, the fact that economists have not worked this out, it seems to me. And it all stems from this notion that somehow we didn't get our hands dirty enough, but we neglected this whole area. In part, you can trace it through a history of thought, sort of way of looking at things. The theoretical welfare economics, post-Pagoo theoretical welfare economics, that sort of was prevalent up until about the 60s, certainly through the World War II period, the Keynesian period. That welfare economics was basically a theory of market failure. Under certain conditions, the market would not live up to its ideals. Competition wouldn't work, competitive enterprise wouldn't work because of externalities, spillovers, whatever you might talk about. And in fact, the socialist controversy was the background of that. And when I was a graduate student in the mid-century, it was general opinion that the big socialist calculation controversy that Lange and Lerner and others had, Dixon and others had in fact defeated Mises, that Mises had lost the argument. Now, of course, we know that Mises won the argument, and that's been totally changed. But the point was that the market failure literature was showing markets don't work, but they didn't simply step over. And then the socialist calculation showed that socialism in that planning context didn't work. So what they overlooked totally was how does the collective alternative really work in a setting where you don't have a planned, total centralized economy and you don't have a market, but you have particular activities, particular provision of particular goods and services, collectivized. Sort of what we might call a theory of collective action has not been, it's just been lacking. There's no, even at the level of the abstract models, because the social choice literature and public choice literature to an extent sort of came out of the arrow-black notion of the impossibility theorem, that is to say, majority rule concentrated on selecting amongst alternatives when you had cycles and so forth. And then the black notion that somehow that would not be true, you wouldn't have the cycle when in fact you have median, under certain conditions. And in this case you have a median voter theorem, so the median voter theorem came up, a lot of concentration on that, but very, very little, if anything, on this, what you might call a bare bones abstract theory of collective action. That is, how do collective decisions actually get made? let's sort of impose an abstract model and try to see how that works. Well, looking at and I don't make any claim whatsoever to have an empirical basis here, and it's very much within my own reading of the American situation, so it may not apply to other countries at all here. It doesn't, obviously major differences in this respect. But what is the central feature of the fiscal process? How do choices get made? Well, this whole notion of rationally cutting through the fog and letting complete rationality, that is an irrational passion for dispassionate rationality. Because obviously people confronted as they are with particular setting, particular situation, particular circumstances, aren't going to be able to look beyond the fog, so to speak. I did a paper in 1954, which nobody paid any attention at all to, namely which I called Individual Choice in Voting in the Market. In writing that paper, I was very surprised to find that nobody had really looked at the particular decision problem facing an individual as he participates in the collective enterprise, as opposed to participating in the market. And in the market, an individual chooses the outcome. So the outcomes are in the choice set for the individual, but in the collective enterprise, no matter how you model it, outcomes are not in the choice process. This is where game theory helps, the game theory notion helps. Outcomes emerge, so what the individual is faced with is a choice among strategies. Necessarily, he doesn't choose outcomes. There can be no outcome. So you get a totally different logic of the process. And what is interesting about going back to the fiscal notion here, what is interesting is that there was categorical separation made institutionally between the spending side and the taxing side. Now, this is one of Wicksel's central arguments. Wicksell had probably the most influence on my thinking of anybody. One of Wicksel's central arguments was, of course, you needed to tie the spending side to the tax side. You needed to have a financing before you authorize any spending. And you see that mixed occasionally in discussions and occasionally in resolutions of different houses of Congress, but it's never been severely used as a constraint to mount anything. They tried to do that under the Graham-Rudman back 20, 30 years ago, but it failed like they all tend to fail. And actually, you see, this reflects an historical pattern that has been carried over into modern institutions without recognition that we're no longer in the setting which was modeled earlier. The original tradition out of which public finance, public economics, everything arose was the German tradition, the old-fashioned German tradition, whereby the prince chose to spend, that is, he chose to make war or not make war, and then he came back to the parliament to try to get them to give the taxes to finance the wars that the prince made. So the prince was a kind of monolithic decision maker, able to spend funds, but in fact expecting the legislative branch to pick up and finance that. So it's a sort of a catching up, always catching up, the legislative branch always catching up with the spending side. And out of that came the tradition of German scholarship in public economics or public finance, which is called cameralism, as a matter of fact. They were advising the prince as to how to spend the money. It was what the political economists were doing. And then their other aspect was collecting the taxes in such a way that minimized the burden. all on this notion that somehow there's a monolithic, centralized decision maker, failure to see that as we developed into democracy, where you had multiple decision makers, multiple sovereigns, if you want to call it that, this sort of pattern no longer holds gold, but is carried forward in our own current modern institutional context, where we actually have appropriations committees, appropriations agencies, budget-making agencies, which are totally separated from the revenue side. It shows up in our whole political structure rather than any sort of institutionalized tie in between two sides of the account. Now, attempts have been made historically to build in this recognition that the two sides have to be taken into account, but they've never been successful. We've had various budgetary reform movements. There was one in 1921, 1974, and again in the 90s, attempts to sort of do something about this, but they never work. They never do provide the constraints that are necessary to keep the fiscal house in order, and of course interacting with the idea of justification of deficits coming out of the Keynesian logic and carrying through with this sort of institutional complex that I mentioned in that second category. You've got this pressure to never really carry out any sort of constraint that would require you to finance spending when you, at the same time, you authorize that spending. So that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have benefit taxation. It does mean that you have to somehow have offsetting pressures on the tax side to offset those on the spending side. At least blocking them together to some extent will, in fact, offer a constraint. Otherwise, we're going to be in this fiscal tragedy. We're going to be tapping the commons with the result that we're going to have continued erosion in the value product that our economy is generating. Because every time we shift to a collective as opposed to taking something out of the market and putting it under a collective choice-making process, given the modern institution, we're bound to be reducing the total value of product that's being produced in the economy. In other words, there is an excess burden of overextension of the budget in all of these categories that we, in fact, carry out. Analytically, that's what I'm working on now, what we're working on now. As I say, this is a work in process or progress, and I haven't really got handles on what I would like to have. I have a very strong intuition that there's a great deal to be done here. That this gap is just awesome that the Congress has left out here that we need to work on. But we haven't been able to work it all out yet. I had this intuition last summer and got excited about it and wrote up something which we call Tea Party logic, arguing that we ought to cut government spending by 1/2 and making an analytical argument in those terms. Well, we sent that off too early. We made a terrible mistake. We sent that off to the Wall Street Journal as an op-ed piece. And I'm very grateful that the Wall Street Journal turned it down. I would have been extremely embarrassed had it been published, and I would have spent the rest of the time I had justifying that logic. But on the other hand, after I sort of was glad that happened, little episode happened, aside. But then I got to thinking more, and I'm thinking more and more about it. The sort of Tea Party logic is coming back. And I think I can make or we can make, under certain rigid, abstract conditions, under models, that we can make an argument that at least there may be some logic behind saying that we ought to cut collectivized activities by 1/2, and that we would all be better off if we could do that. And that's what we're trying to develop. But under what conditions would that have to be less or more or this sort of thing? And what the logic of that is, you can think of this easy. If I had a blackboard, I'd put it on the board for you. And say, just think of an ordinary evaluation curve for whatever collective activity, whatever activity you put in a collective sector. You want to collectivize this. And assume now you're going to imagine the individual as voting for alternative amounts of this good. Well, clearly, that good has to be financed, but forget about the finance now. Just think, well, what if that good were free? What if there is a genuinely free good out there? And you can tap it, anybody can tap into that good that has it available. Anybody can tap into it. Well, you would expect in that case that they would use that good out to the point of satiety. They use it so that as long as there was any positive, value to be expected from that good, you would in fact expect that to be exploited, which would be proper. And therefore the optimal usage of that free good would be to use it out to where you get the full value under that sort of imaginary rectangle subtended between that curve of evaluation and your actual ordinate and a half system. You squeeze out that whole value by using it out to that point. Well, impose a linearity assumption on that now. If that evaluation function is linear, then you also know that if you impose a constraint that there's a cost, that good is going to cost something. That good is going to cost something. It's not free. Forget, shift away from the free good and think of a good as costing something, and normalize that in terms of saying dollars worth. So your quantity down here is going to be dollars worth, the amount of goods you can get for $1, and that's your valuation function. Well, then if you do that, you see the cost of that good is drawing away from other goods out in an idealized market here. It's going to be $1. So your cost function is going to be $1. Then you know if you impose a linearity, then you know then that the optimal exploitation of that good would, under collectivization, would be 1/2 the total society. That's how we got the 1/2 notion, that you ought to cut budget back by 1/2. But now, that seems plausible, but what would people actually do under simplistic collective models here? Well, how much would you actually get spent? Well, what about this model in which people behave as if the good is free? We know the good's not free. We all have a vague sense that somebody's going to pay for it. But under what conditions will we rationally, in terms of an individual choice and ordering of these options, under what conditions will an individual rationally act as if that good is free? Well, if you think about it, you see, and look at the actual institutions under which we make choices, fiscal choices, we may come close to that particular set of behavior norms, as opposed to trying to, assuming that individuals cut through and see exactly what their tax price is going to be. Public finance economists, including me in several things, have used this notion of tax price as, say, individuals sort of recognizing that even though this is a collectivized good, that if you purchase another $1 million worth or go for another $1 million worth, that's going to be a tax price to him of so much and more. But that means that the amount he's going to pay for that good is going to depend on how much he ordered or how much he votes for, that sort of thing. Well, there may be situations where the amount that you're going to be taxed is not connected at all with the demand for the good. So if there's this total divorce between the valuation of the good and the tax that you're going to be charged, then you're rational, completely rational to act as if that good is free, and therefore demand that good out to the point of full satiety. And if you demand that good out to the point of full satiety, then, in fact, if these are linear functions, then you will get this idea of we ought to cut budgets back by 1/2, and we'd all be better off because we would be eliminating, we'd be getting the benefits of having the collective good, but we'd be eliminating this excess burden that stems from over-regulation, over-provision, over-spending. Well, anyway, that's sort of what I'm working on now, and I'm in a fuzz as to how to go about it. But it's certainly true that we do have this sort of traditional historical notion of the executive branch making the spending decisions and expecting the legislative branch to pick up the change. And people reacting, putting pressure on the executive to carry out a this spending program. The priority of spending is always there. And therefore, not really paying attention in their pressure for, you sort of separate the pressures for spending, not really holding back on those because of the tax side, because they're divorced from the tax side. Tax side is something else again. And therefore, you get something akin to this, we act as if collectively organized goods or activities are free, even though in a vague sense we recognize that somebody's going to pay for it. And that doesn't require any illusion or anything else. It's a perfectly rational structure given the institutions that we have. Well, anyway, that's sort of where I am in this, and I'm hoping to get beyond it if we can get somewhat more formal discussion of this, work out some models. Now, obviously, the next step is to, if you sort of follow along with that, the next step is what we can do about getting out of this tragedy, out of this dilemma of commons here. Then it seems to me that we can do something, but I'm not sure we can handle the problem. But obviously, we can handle the first set of problems. We could impose a balanced budget amendment with teeth in it that would work to some extent. We almost got that in the early 1980s. There was a lot of pressure to work toward a balanced budget amendment. The process at that time was to get 33 or so states to a sufficient number, 2/3 of the states to propose such a convention, have an amendment to the Constitution. And we got pretty close in terms of the number of states that passed such resolutions, but never did quite get there. That movement kind of died away because the budget deficits didn't seem to be as much of a problem gradually moved through, with economic growth, we moved, so the budget deficit became sort of surpluses during the Clinton years, and an aftermath of the Reagan tax cuts and so forth and so on. So movement died away until we started the ballooning deficits in this century, and they're just getting completely out of sight. Well, so they're beginning to be talked now about the possibility of reviving that notion of a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, which would require the government to keep the balance of the budget except for capital projects. And the only problem there is, of course, given politics the way it works, everything would be called a capital project, which is precisely what has happened with Germany. Germany, they do have in their constitution, they have a balanced budget requirement with an exception for capital projects. And of course they call everything capital projects. And but they are in better shape than many of the European partners, so to speak. So we could handle that problem all right. We could conceptually at least get a balanced budget amendment that would work, that would have teeth to it, and we could get that problem. The second set of problems that I mentioned, the generality problem, the problem of asymmetry between the tax side and spending side in terms of the generality. Roger Collins and I wrote a book which we call Politics by Principle, Not Interest, in which we were arguing that we ought to extend this notion of generality, which still applies to some extent with taxation. Not fully, but at least it applies to some extent. Extend that to the spending side so that any program spending, in particular welfare spending, would have to be general. Then that would in fact put pressure on the particular groups to rein back their spending demands if they knew that everybody would do it. If you had a situation, and this led us to favor, in terms of particular policy on transfer policy, it favors a set of demograms rather than particularized, targeted, means-tested criteria for qualification or eligibility. That is to say, if every time you do something for one group, you have to do the same thing for every group. McGovern had this in the platform way back in '72. So you have a system of demograms. Everybody, no matter who it is, gets this grant, even though some paid a lot more back in taxes than they get in the grant. You still have a general norm in the distribution. I mentioned that one time to Assar Lindbeck and talking about the Swedish situation and so forth and so on, and Assar's reaction was that would of course mean that you have a budget so large that it would bust any meaningful plausible limits. And in a sense that would be a problem, but on the other hand it would actually have this constraint, a considerable constraint on how much you would in fact enact as transfer policy if in fact everybody had to have the same result of the same eligibility. Dwight Lee and I wrote, not related to this, but earlier, Dwight Lee and I wrote a piece in which we argued that about tariffs, that if you had a rule that if you have a tariff on one product, exactly the same had to be applied to all products, then you wouldn't have tariffs because it wouldn't be in the interest of anybody to have tariffs under that scheme. It's only in interest to have tariffs if you can particularize your particular industry to getting the tariff and the others not. But that's a side point, but it's the same point. That introducing generality can in fact act as a constraint. In our book, the book I wrote with Connell, we put a little preface in which a little frontispiece citation from Hayek, in which Hayek said if you could really enforce the fact that, as the Constitution say, that the government shall not engage in discrimination of any kind, you wouldn't need anything else in the Constitution, which was the point we were essentially trying to make, or what you'd make in terms of this generality norm. That would require, of course, a lot of changes institutionally to accomplish something like that, but it's within the possible. This third set of, all related together here, but this third set of institutionalized problems that we face, a lot could be done without major constitutional shifts by the working rules of our legislative institutions. If we go to change our committee structure so that the same committee would have to be charged with levy of taxes and spending on particular areas, you get some offsetting pressures here. You get some. You wouldn't get this riding off as if you don't pay anything for it. So a lot can be done by rather detailed institutional shifts in the working rules of the legislature. Well, anyway, it does seem to me that that's just about all I have to say here, except that I ended up by saying there's no adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The opposite side of that adage ought to be, if it is broke, fix it. Now, we all recognize that the fiscal system is totally broken. And we've got to do something about it one way or the other. We're forced to do something about it. And we need to get at the underlying why we have it, rather than sort of jumping on top of it and say, well, let's cut back, let's have a plan to raise taxes here or cut budgets here. We need to somehow get at the institutional undergirding, the institutional structure, in order to maybe get some handles on this. At least it makes for interesting work and interesting exercise. I'm finding it rather exciting to get into some of this without making much progress. So we'll leave it there, and then we'll have a little discussion if you want.
I've got this mic, and I'm going to pass it around as you raise your hand, because we're taking this. It'd be great if we could catch the questions as well as the comments. If you could say your name.
My name is Richard Hammer, Professor Buchanan. You early in your talk, you talked about the financial crisis and as if it's something that we should have expected, that we shouldn't expect markets, the participants in markets, to figure out their own rules. That they don't know the rules and that they'll never figure out their own rules.
Yeah.
Yet the whole body of your talk was about a different class of people, among whom you are a leader, who are trying to figure out the rules of government. As if you know that people who participate in markets can never create an order through their own efforts. You know that people who participate in government and the design of government institutions can create a successful order. And that doesn't connect in my thinking. And I'd like to hear your response.
First of all, that's a very good comment. That's a very good comment, and I have worried about that particular problem. That is exactly right. You're right on. First of all, to go back to saying the market can't create its own rules, there is some work in game theory, right? And I'm not familiar with it in detail, but there is a little bit of work in game theory going on now where they are trying to design games such that the game players themselves, as they play, can involve proper rules. So there is some work going on at an analytical level that in fact you can generate a set of rules within the playing of the game. So it has some relevance here that I'm not detailed familiar with. But you're absolutely right in the sense that if you say the market can't generate its own rules, yet I'm somehow saying that we can, at another level of analysis, somehow design or choose rules and somehow within which markets can work. And we're putting ourselves in a position of sort of being the philosopher kings here in a way. We don't want to do that necessarily. There's work, as you know, in what they call design now, talking about constructive design of institutions such that you can get the outcomes that you want. But again, you have to pattern back on the outcomes. And I'm not happy with this assuming the role that we could design these institutions that could have a new Madison, so to speak. And how we might, what I'm really getting at, you see, is really, Adam Smith said the market works, but we need the proper laws and institutions. That was his word, laws and institutions, which evolve in a way. But I'm not willing to accept the fact that whatever has evolved is efficient or is desirable or preferable. I think we can do better than evolution. I don't go along with the late Hayek and others who simply say, well, let's let these rules evolve. I think we can lay on rules. I think James Madison made a difference. But on the other hand, I don't think that Madison can, in fact, argue that somehow he is more prescient, more observant than anybody else, or that other people could not be. So I think in one sense that you put your finger on what is really the problem with my way I'm thinking about this.
Matt?
My name is Gilles Compagnolo. I come from France. If I understand well, seen from the US, France may have some socialistic aspects to its system. On the other hand, you were talking about how it's difficult in the US to think about spending, cut spending by 2. In France, the civil service system now has been, despite some reluctance, ruled along the rule of 2 people, out of 2 people who retire, only 1 is replaced. So it seems to be easy in France, or maybe easier than here. That would be the other side. And some issues are common, like when you were talking about balanced budget put into the Constitution. This is at present a large debate that we have at home. So my question is very large. It's about the international constraints in this American fiscal tragedy. What are the constraints? What would be the advantages? You made some comparison with Germany, but what about that international side in your talk?
Yeah, well, I explicitly, one reason I put in the title the sources of America's fiscal tragedy, because I explicitly wanted to limit my discussion to the institutional structure more or less as we have it here in this country, because I recognize that if you have a working parliamentary system as opposed to the federal republic system, as opposed to our system, you can in fact get much more. You don't get into these problems of the multiplicity of multi-sovereign problems like we have in the United States. Now ours is built in because we wanted to do that, to delay certain actions and so forth, the Madison view. But I acknowledge that once we get into this bind like we're in, if we had a working, simply majoritarian parliamentary system, we could get out of it much easier. Maggie Thatcher being the example of, moving in and doing things that we could never have done that way in this country. What you're say about France, I'm not simply not familiar. In part, I was just trying to shield myself from saying that this was more general than it is. But what you said about France is encouraging here, if that is the case. And it's no doubt true that you could probably do things to some extent easier than we could in this country because of that. Although you don't quite have a pure parliamentary system either. I'm not sure how your system works. Anyway.
David Levy. I'd like to draw you out a little bit on your point that economists have no serviceable model of institutional governance. And I think there's just overwhelming evidence that that is the case, just from the reaction of the economics community to the prize award to the late Eleanor Ostrom. They had no idea who she was, or what she'd done, that she had in fact created serviceable models of institutional governance. And so this raises, I think, the question of what are the incentives of economists? Why don't we focus on high-valued things and instead of the things we do? So if somebody does precisely the thing that you say needs to be done, I think you're right, it's ignored. I mean, it's embarrassingly ignored. In fact, that the Times obituary made that point with a certain amount of pungency, how embarrassing it was that we didn't know what she'd done.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to know how we might generate incentives to do this. Economists, like everybody else, encourage followers to just go along with whatever is being done. What pays off within their narrow circles, they're difficult feedbacks. There are not many feedbacks that, to reward people who become innovators in that sense, who break away from the fold.
My name is Stefan Kohler. Living in Germany, I want to ask you about this issue about the balanced budget, which you were talking about. We have now the debate in the European Union for the so-called debt brake to be introducing all the national constitutions. Yeah. And my question is, what are, in your opinion, the conditions or the prerequisites for such a constitutional innovation to really take place and to really be there sustainably? How do we get public opinion, accept such a constitutional innovation, and let this process of having the debt brake not being like a good weather innovation, but something which really can persist in a way? So once we have it in the Constitution, how do we keep it in the Constitution and it stays there effectively?
Well, that is what we have to face. I think that looking back on the European experience, I was a strong supporter of the European Union early on, and I felt like there was a genuine opportunity that Europe had to become something like the United States, which was a genuine federalism, perhaps more effective federalism than the United States, with less centralization. Or you have national units, but have genuine federal structure. And I was surprised that there was a lot of opposition, both from the right and the left, because the old socialist tradition was pretty strong to concentrate a lot of power, and then there was a great deal of opposition to any sort of surrender of sovereignty. But it was obvious you had to have some sovereignty surrendered to the central agency to mount that thing. And so then that's been fought out. But then they put in, at the Maastricht, they put in this constraint, namely when they went into the monetary union, this constraint that in fact they were to keep the fiscal process within certain limits. And of course, France and Germany both immediately broke their own limits. Now, had that was a critical point. See me, had they, in fact, stuck with those limits, these other countries would not have been encouraged to violate them just with abandon. And as a result, you've got the whole situation you're in now. Whether or not you could, in fact, get them to organize something in which they do recognize some kind of limits, like what you call breaks on you can think of that as being negotiated, perhaps, but then the critical question that you raised is how you get public opinion to do that. And there, I think it is, in a way it's bad, the sort of European idea looked like it was catching on and spreading, but now you seem to be getting a resurgence of nationalism a little bit. And that's unfortunate if it is. It seems to me that you need to have Europeans to think of themselves as European as well as whatever the other is. And somehow it would be better if you could somehow organize something at which they're competing on certain levels and not competing on other levels. And I'm not sure how it's going to work out.
My name is Michael Ambrosi. I'm from Germany, and I would be interested in some international aspect which Gilbert already addressed. Isn't it a great difference for a country like the United States, which is a sovereign debtor and which has a very large part of its debt in third countries like China or Japan, and a country like Japan where the public debt is held among its own citizens. So the tragedy for a downfall of the American debt would be worldwide, and so it does not really cover the citizens themselves if the debt is unsustainable, whereas the situation in a country like Japan is entirely different. Do you see this also like this?
I understand the argument, but I think my thrust is sort of the opposite of what you're saying. That is to say, I don't think there's that much difference between who holds the debt. It seems to me debt is debt, and a default on the debt. It doesn't matter who's going to hold it. Well, obviously, the United States is going to default by inflation eventually. That's bound to happen, I think. But the fact that either Americans hold the debt or the Chinese hold the debt is not going to matter that much, in the sense it's still default and still going to damage the international structure. But I think too much, in other words, what I'm really saying is I think too much is made of this distinction between internally held and externally held debt. I acknowledge that the dominant position of the United States vis-a-vis the rest of the world, the spillovers are more severe in a certain sense than they would be otherwise. But I don't think this idea that Japan has both of Japanese debt is held by Japanese really would in fact make it, obviously would make it easier for them to default. Imposing the burden on their own people internationally would make it easier. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any sharp break between the two, but that's just my reaction here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dave Braff from Randolph-Macon College. I was interested in your comment that James Madison made a difference in matters, and it kind of goes in tandem with the overplay of rational expectations. And so what I'm wondering is, especially like part two of your talk, we just had a nice model of spending versus taxation. Does culture matter in there? And is that perhaps a reason that economists duck these issues? I'm reading a book now called Economics as Religion. that kind of gets at that. And there's a guy back away, Gorski, and he did cross-country analysis on disciplinization from above by elites and disciplinization from below, from the masses. And kind of, instead of the American case, is more characterized by disciplinization from below. And so with respect to Madison, Madison didn't come out of a vacuum. He came out of a largely Calvinist, puritanical, Enlightenment culture with dominant theological and philosophical leaders. And today, if you look at the landscape of the United States and you say, name a dominant philosophical leader, a theological leader, I find it hard to define that. And so the masses are looking for disciplinization from beneath the typical American case. Do you see a cultural piece that may help to explain our lack of discipline with respect to the fiscal problems?
That's an interesting comment. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I buy into what you're saying. Really, it seems to me that's very plausible, and that's very important. It might be very, very significant. I'm not sure. That's a good point.
Professor Buchanan, I'm Christopher Martin from here at the Jepson School. I had a question about a possible constitutional reform that was suggested by your talk. You mentioned the pre-modern situation in which the prince or the king would essentially originate the budgetary proposal and it would then be approved or disapproved by the Parliament or the Assembly. Do you think it would be to our advantage to consider that within the American system? Now, of course, the president nominally, I suppose, originates the budget proposal, but everyone understands that the legislature is then going to be able to manipulate it. Would it be wise to consider giving the president the sole power to originate spending proposals and give the legislature only an up or down vote? And as I say that, it makes me uncomfortable because, of course, it does seem to be undemocratic in some way. But would that be another alternative to try to restore fiscal discipline?
Well, I think you might get what you call, you say, fiscal discipline. You might get more fiscal discipline. You would clearly, if you had a monolithic decision maker, simply by the nature of the case, you would in fact be looking at a larger constituency, and so in a sense, you would expect, as opposed to these fragmented polycentric decision structures that we have, you no doubt would have one result would be a more coherent pattern of results, but whether it would be worth giving up your liberty in a sense to go out and form your own structures, that's a trade-off you make. But no doubt, I think in a certain context there wouldn't be such a trade-off there.
I'm David Mitch. You've covered a lot of ground. You may have gone over this, but I'd like to, you seem pessimistic about the role that financial markets might play in sort of imposing some kind of incentives, at least, for politicians to get their act together. There's stories have been told about that. I mean, you probably know the North wine gas analysis and their notion of credible commitment. In one sense, what's happened, I think, with the U.S. government, kind of that credible commitment to a certain degree has been lost, and there's a whole issue with the Moody's downgrading things. But on the other hand, it seems that state legislators do respond to some degree to that. One reason why they seem pretty eager to try to maintain balanced budgets is because of the standing of state bonds and financial markets.
Yeah.
And so I guess a part of wondering whether you're being overly pessimistic about the role that financial markets incentives might play in providing some incentive to get for politicians to get their act together, but also like to hear more about why you seem on that sort of pessimistic about that.
Well, I don't have a sense that I am either pessimistic or optimistic about that too much. I acknowledge the role that can play in imposing constraints to some extent, but I don't think that's all important. But I think it's no doubt important. I I don't feel happy about saying too much, but don't know too much about that area. But no doubt it's true. No doubt it's true. It would work in a certain sense, within limits. But how much constraint it would impose is another question.
Professor Buchanan, my name is Michael Thomas from Utah State University. I have a question just to think about Keynes and his legacy. I appreciate your comments about the balanced budget and how important it is to get the idea that the budget has to be balanced, and teaching macroeconomics and dealing with the idea that somehow there's a business cycle of going to spend and when we need to, and then we're going to tax and pay it back. All that kind of stuff is a major problem for precisely the reasons you point out, both today and in your book, Democracy and Deficit. But I think that we have to address somehow the compelling logic of Keynes' analogy to a boat's captain at sea who understands that on average the surface of the sea is flat like glass, but that during a storm something has to be done. I think that the very nature of a constitutional order, the very idea of rules, is under threat precisely when there's a financial crisis. We see the Occupy movement. We see back in the 30s Huey Long in Louisiana, things like this. And so I'm wondering, is there a certain amount of pragmatism that we need to approach this issue with, and make any concessions during financial downturns, large recessions, depressions, in order to preserve the constitutional order itself? Or do we need to sort of make this logic argument, the economic argument, convince people that they should just ride it out in order to avoid this deficit in the long run?
Well, it does depend on your underlying presuppositions about to the extent to which a market economy would work under desirable rules and patterns. I can understand the logic of the point that you're making here, why you might have a situation where you want to depart from, say you had a fairly rigid balanced budget rule and you had a major depression, then you maybe need to violate that rule for that reason, not for the standard classical reasons. But that, you're underlying that presupposition is that you could have such a big depression. Now, my own prejudices are, and I admit that I don't have any backup for this fundamentally, is that if you had a genuine rule of fiscal monetary policy, if you had a fiscal monetary fix, if you had a rigid balanced budget rule, and a situation where the money was constitutionalized such that you maintained the value of money, that you wouldn't have Great Depressions. You couldn't have it. It would not merge. I mean, I'm a student of Henry Simons in this respect. On the other hand, if I didn't just have that underlying presupposition, then I'd come out exactly where you're talking about. So, and I don't know how you switch from one to the other here.
My name is Anne Marie Conley. Good morning, sir. I have a question along the same lines as you did, and that is, do I understand you correctly that if we're going to get control over our fiscal house, we have to throw countercyclical policy out of the window? Are they utterly incompatible? Is there no way to have both at the same time, where we do have an ability to counteract depressions without our budget going amok?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you do have to throw it out the window. You have to remove fiscal policy from your agenda, so to speak, in a certain sense. But I think it is related to what I just said. If you fixed your monetary structure such that the money was going to be stable and people knew that, and businesses knew that, and investors knew that, and so forth and so on, your value of money was stable, I don't think you'd have the problem of cycles. spending cycles would be gone.
Yeah, follow-up question. A follow-up question on that is, as you know, the budget of the United States, a large portion of it goes to entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid.
Yeah.
Those have nothing to do with fiscal policy. That's really social policy. So maybe the problem isn't the counter-cyclical Keynesianism as much as the welfare state. Your thoughts?
Well, in a sense, you're right. In a sense, and all I was listing here was trying to list these institutional things that, in fact, seem to facilitate the problems that we face in this strict financial problem of deficits and so forth and so on. No doubt these entitlement programs, these welfare programs, transfer programs, are generated by other pressures, other than countercyclical, certainly, pressures, other pressures generated. But in one sense, the balanced budget thing is what I tried to mention. I didn't mention it very well. That it is not so much the explicit unbalancing of the budget for Keynesian or macro purposes that's involved, but it's this, how that idea led to this view that the disparity between the spending and the taxing, the revenue shortfall, can be readily financed by just the budget being a residual catch-all. That is, if you have this much tax and you have this much spending, then this much is going to be handled by the budget. And the fact that the Keynesian logic sort of say, well, if you can justify that, it's not any damage and so forth. So I think your point's a good one in the sense that I ought to balance that argument a little more like that. But it's hard to state exactly what, at least for me, exactly what is involved here. It's not so much a deliberative use of the budget, it's rather an acquiescence in the fact that you can have a deficit as a debt as a means of financing that shortfall.
One last question.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Clark, also at the Jepson School. I have a question, and I guess it's somewhat related to the question that was asked, and to balanced budget amendments, which I understand many states have passed balanced budget amendments. They've had, the legislature has agreed, they've had this public demand to pass a balanced budget amendment, but that have run into similar problems like what you described with Germany, where there is some loophole that gets taken advantage of. And I think in New York there was some fancy accounting that made it work out so that on paper it looked like they had a balanced budget amendment depending upon when you record the expenditures and the revenue. And so people got really worked up about this sneaky accounting, but the fact of the matter is they were still facing all of the pressures which you had identified earlier, which is that people, they like government services and they don't like to be taxed. And they don't want their politicians telling them what they don't want to hear, which is that you can't have all these things at once. So the problem wasn't, she said, the problem wasn't the accounting, the problem is the problem. That people, want more government services and they want to pay for it. And so you can have it, even if people say in principle we want a balanced budget amendment, we think this is a good idea, it seems as though it's not really worked in the states to actually do what it was supposed to, because you still have all these different pressures, which, it's helpful that you pointed out that this is just what goes with democracy in a lot of ways. And I'm not sure what can be done, I mean, in the way of sort of the kind of people really being willing to discipline themselves. I mean, I'm not really even persuaded that, as soon as the Tea Party says they don't want to get rid of Social Security and Medicare, they like those problems just fine, As soon as they are saying, we're willing to put Social Security, or we're willing to have our taxes raised in order to keep these things, I'll believe that there is that sort of desire for discipline. But I don't know what short of that can really change the incentives that are at work. I mean, I don't know if you think that there are things that politicians really could be telling telling their constituents about what they can and can't do, or I mean, what do you see as how do we deal with those incentives, changing those incentives short of changing our form of government?
Well, that's a good question to end on in a way, because I am not quite willing to give up on the people. Somehow I feel a moral obligation to think we can pull out the people. I think I have a moral obligation to think that somehow or other, ultimately, we won't do what you say. You're absolutely right, but the danger is, of course, that we're not willing to tax ourselves to pay for what we want. And that's certainly true. And we've allowed this culture, and it gets back to the cultural question that we made earlier. Underneath, James Madison didn't come out of a culture that amounted to something, and he did a tremendous job in putting together something that stood up pretty well for a long time. But with the erosion in our culture, are the people capable? They don't have a leader, as was mentioned. They don't have a guru to follow. And nor would they show, nor necessarily would we want one if there was one. But on the other hand, the sort of generalized cultural mess we're in does not lend itself to my position of having a moral obligation to hope that the people, yes. I mean, it's much more difficult to sustain that than it was 50 years ago. So, I don't know where we are.
I think we've got lots to talk about during our break.